Okay, this video is going to cover Module 10 in biology, and this is for the Great Commission Academy students. So we're going to cover Chapter 10 in just 1 week. So obviously we're not, because of time constraints, we're not going to be able to cover everything, but we'll hit the most important information to give you a good overview of Chapter 10. So Chapter 10 deals with ecology. And ecology is, it's how organisms interact with other organisms and also with their surroundings. So how organisms interact with other organisms and with their surroundings. So this should tell you that ecology doesn't just deal with living things, because many things in surroundings are not living organisms. So, for example, water or rock or mud, those would be part of the surroundings that an organism interacts with that are not living things. So ecology is just a study of how living organisms interact with each other and how they interact with their surroundings. When we begin to talk about how to study ecology, we usually break it down into like subgroups. And one of the most important subgroups, and one of the easiest really to study, is a population. And when you look at a population, the population is, it's a term that is used to refer to organisms that can interbreed with each other. So a population are interbreeding organisms. And how they interact with each other, or how they coexist with each other. So, for example, we would talk about a population of dogs. Like if there's a population of wild dogs, those dogs are able to interbreed with each other, so they would constitute a population. If you have a group of wild dogs and wild cats, those would be different populations, because cats and dogs can't interbreed with each other. So population is those organisms that can interbreed. However, then the next level up is a community. So a community is when you have several populations that live in the same area. So here you could talk about a community of dogs and cats. If you have a population of dogs and a population of cats living in the same area, then you could talk about them as a community. Okay, then we expand a little bit farther out and we talk about an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is several populations and their surroundings. So a community just deals with the interbreeding or living organisms, the ecosystem now takes in their surroundings. So this would be several populations and their surroundings. So we've just expanded it out a little bit more. And then the next one up would be a biome, which is where you have several ecosystems. So, so a population is interbreeding organisms. Then if you have several populations together, that constitutes a community. So put several communities together with, or several communities or populations together with their surroundings, then you have an ecosystem. And then if you have several ecosystems combined and you talk about their climate and plant life, then you have a biome. Now the key, the real key for all of this is that you've got to maintain balance. So the organisms that are living within an ecosystem and the chemical and physical makeup of their surroundings you have to maintain a balance so that life can continue. And if something is introduced into an ecosystem that upsets that balance, then that can jeopardize the survival of the ecosystem as a whole, or other organisms within the ecosystem. In the kind of the southeast part of Florida, there is an area of forest that's called the Florida Everglades. And maybe some of you have been there, but some time ago, people were keeping pythons as pets. So it's a type of large constrictor snake. People keep those as pets, and they can grow to be quite large. And so there were people who no longer wanted to have these pythons as pets, and they released them into the Everglades. And because within the Florida Everglades, they have no natural predators, because they don't belong in that ecosystem. So there's no predators for them. And so these pythons have overtaken the Florida Everglades, and they have become a real problem with the ecosystem in that area. So the state of Florida now, they've done planned hunts where they issue a certain number of permits, and they have people go in and try to kill as many as they can, because these pythons are not native. They're not native to that area, and they have really upset the ecosystem. So this balance in an ecosystem is very, very important. Okay, when we talk about an ecosystem, some of these words we've already talked about, but maybe you're familiar with a food chain, and we'll look at one in just a moment. So a food chain shows the relationship between organisms within an ecosystem. And it can give us a little bit, it can give us some information, but and actually a better way of looking at the relationship between organisms is something that's called a food web, and we'll look at some examples of both of those in a minute. But regardless of which one you use, within that web or chain, there are producers, and as you already know, these make their own food. and they are a food source for other creatures. Okay, so when we look at the food chain or the food web, you'll see that these producers serve as a big food source for other creatures. And as we've seen before, there are some organisms that only eat producers, and we call those herbivores. So these only eat producers. They only eat plants. So the lowest level on a food chain or a food web would be these producers that make their own food. Okay, but then as you move through the food web or the food chain, then we get consumers, and we designate consumers as primary, secondary, or tertiary. So a primary consumer would be one that eats only producers. So again, this would be an herbivore, right? They eat only plants. Then we have, and sometimes this is just designated like that. That's the symbol for primary. Then there are secondary consumers. And secondary consumers, they eat primary consumers. So you have an organism that only eats plants, and then the secondary consumers eat that organism. So that's called a secondary consumer, and that would be another way to designate is like this: a 2 with a little circle like a degree symbol. And then lastly is a tertiary consumer. Tertiary consumer. And this would be designated like this. And those eat secondary consumers. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that something can be a tertiary consumer and a secondary consumer at the same time. So, depending on what it is eating, if it's eating a secondary consumer, then it would be considered a tertiary consumer. But if that same animal eats primary consumers also, then in that case it would be a secondary consumer. So it can be simultaneously a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer, or it can be simultaneously a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. So we'll see how that works out when we look at the food web. Okay, so let's take a look at. So here is a picture that shows, this is basically just a food chain. And so in this case, we would talk about the plant as being the lowest on the food chain, and so it's a producer. And then if the mouse eats the plant, then that would be a primary consumer. Then the snake eats the mouse, so there the snake is consuming a primary consumer, so it's a secondary consumer. And then the hawk eats the snake, so that makes it a tertiary consumer. So this is just a food chain. That just shows the simple relationship between these different organisms. Now, as I said, often, in fact, usually, this is too simple. So then we can look instead at what is called a food web. And the food web with the food web you can look at all the interactions, and obviously even here you have to limit, because you have to limit the number that you can include or this thing would get out of hand. But the food web allows you to look at interaction between organisms. So for example, when we look at our plants here, rabbits so they would be primary consumers. The mouse would be a primary consumer. A butterfly would be a primary consumer. However, if we look at something like well, let's see, which one can we look at? So here, a grasshopper. Okay, so let's look at the raccoon. Okay, so the raccoon. This arrow shows that the raccoon consumes plants. So in that case, the raccoon would be a primary consumer, right? So this would be primary because they're consuming plants. However, the raccoon also I guess the raccoon's not the greatest example there. Let's look at another one. Which one am I looking at? Okay, so if we look at this songbird, okay, so the songbird will directly eat a praying mantis. Okay, so and the praying mantis there is it's a primary consumer, although it's not shown there. They would eat plants. So this songbird, when it eats the praying mantis, it would be a secondary consumer. But then, when it eats the grasshopper, it would also be a secondary consumer. So the grasshopper eats the plant. So he's eating a primary consumer here, which would make him a secondary consumer. Here, he's also eating a primary consumer. And here, he's eating a primary consumer. So the songbird is eating primary consumers. Okay, then if we look at the hawk, so here, so the hawk is eating the squirrel, and the squirrel eats the plants. Okay, so the squirrel would be a primary consumer, and the hawk is eating a primary consumer, so that would indicate that he's a secondary consumer. Same thing with the rabbit. The rabbit eats plants, and then the hawk eats the plants. So when he's eating the rabbit, he also would be considered a secondary consumer. Then you can look at when the hawk is eating the snake. Okay, so the snake actually consumes a primary consumer. Okay, so here's a primary consumer that eats plants, and the snake is eating that. So here the snake would be a secondary consumer, but now the hawk is eating a secondary consumer. So now in that case, the hawk would be a tertiary consumer. So what I wanted you to see was that the same organism, depending on what is eating, it can be a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer simultaneously, or both, depending on what food source it is eating at that time. The other thing that you should realize about moving between these different levels is that every time that you move up a level, you lose some energy. So when plants are eaten by an organism, a lot of that plant gets wasted. It gets eliminated as heat, or it gets eliminated from the animal's body and it's wasted. So what that means is that it takes a lot of plants to provide energy for an organism. And then when you move to the secondary, what this is showing is that it takes a lot of plants, producers, to provide the energy for the primary consumers, because you lose a lot of energy at this level. And then when you go from primary to secondary consumers, again, it takes a lot of primary consumers to provide for secondary consumers, and then it takes secondary consumers to provide for tertiary consumers. And all this is showing is that every time you move up a level, you are losing some energy. And this is, when looking at a pyramid like this, is one one reason that that many people think that we should eat more of a plant-based organism, because every time you move up through these levels, you're wasting some energy. Now, some of that energy gets, much of that energy gets put back into the ecosystem because bacteria will decompose it. But the important thing here is that, like if we think of the human, so let's see, if we put cows here, and then people eat cows, so we would be secondary consumers in that case. Okay, so it takes a lot of plants to feed a cow, and then humans eat cows, and so you can see that along the way here, a lot of energy gets lost. And so if we were to, at going between a primary and a secondary consumer, that requires a lot of energy. So if we could base our diet more on plants and less on primary consumers, then we might be able to save some of the energy and some of the water and other land and things like that are involved in providing that energy as you move through the different levels. Okay, so the next thing we are going to do, that's food webs and food chain and food webs. And one of the things that you will have on your test is I will give you a figure that is similar to this one, and I will ask you to identify each of the animals as either a primary, secondary, or tertiary consumer, and as I said, it could be more than one. So you'll need to trace the arrows and figure out whether it's a primary, secondary, or tertiary consumer. Okay, the last three things that we are going to do in this module is that we are going to look at three cycles that exist on Earth. We're going to look at the water cycle, we are going to look at the carbon cycle, which I guess the next one we'll look at is the oxygen cycle. Then we will look at the carbon cycle. And I said 3, but the last one we'll look at is the nitrogen cycle. And what we're going to do with each of these is remember that keyword that we talked about in terms of ecosystem is making sure that everything stays in balance. So we will look at each of these cycles separately, realizing, of course, that they do obviously interact with each other, but we're going to look at how do each of these cycles stay within, how do they maintain balance within an ecosystem. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the water cycle. So when we talk about balance, we have to think about how does water enter the ecosystem and how does it leave. And those two need to balance each other out. How does water enter and how does water leave? So if we look at the this figure that is from your book and is on page 311. So this is an ecosystem. This is showing the water cycle at the edge of where the ocean meets land. And the key thing that you need to think about when looking at this figure is the direction that the arrows are pointing. So the arrows that are pointing down indicate that water is going to be entering the ocean, and the arrows that are pointing up indicate that water is going to be leaving the ocean through that means, and these have to balance each other out. So the ocean evaporates water, so water is evaporated from the ocean. It goes into the air, and then that will eventually be, here we're showing the horizontal transportation of water vapor. That's in clouds, right? So that water that gets evaporated from the ocean eventually ends up as water vapor in the air in the form of clouds. And then what happens when the clouds get heavy enough, then you get precipitation over the land, and then the water re-enters. So the arrow is pointing down. Okay, so you can get evaporation from the ocean, and then that forms clouds, and you get precipitation over the land, or you get precipitation over the ocean that returns that water then to the ocean. You can get evaporation of water from land. Besides the evaporation that occurs from water, water can also get evaporated from land. And then, of course, some of this water that falls over land is not going to go directly into the ocean. It will go into the soil, but then some of it will also, you'll get surface runoff. So some of the water from the land will flow directly into the ocean. And then lastly, another way that oxygen can enter the water can enter the air is through transpiration. And this is just this is where water gets evaporated from leaves, from the water gets evaporated from the leaves of the plants. Okay, so let's kind of summarize then. So for the water cycle, how does water leave and how can it re-enter? Okay, so based on that figure, how does water leave? Okay, so it can leave by evaporation from the ocean. It can leave through evaporation of plants. And that part is called transpiration. Okay, and then how does it enter the ocean? Okay, so it can enter the ocean through precipitation, so rain or snow or sleet or hail, precipitation over the ocean or land. It can also enter the ocean through surface runoff. So some of that water will flow directly off of the land into the ocean. So the key here is that you have to have a balance between that water which is leaving and that which is entering whatever particular ecosystem you are studying. It can be, the one we just looked at was ocean, but it can be another. It could be in the forest or along a stream or something in a desert. But the water cycle, the water entering the ecosystem needs to be in balance with the water that is leaving the ecosystem. This figure is showing an example of a watershed, and a watershed it's an ecosystem where all of the runoff from this ecosystem would flow into a single body of water. So sometimes when if you're driving across the United States on an interstate highway, you might see like this is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and that means in that area, anything to the east of that area will flow into the Chesapeake Bay. So that's what a watershed is. And so here again, you can just see the example of, okay, so so here's this body of water that everything in this area is flowing into this body of water. Well, how does water enter that system? Well, you get surface runoff, so you get water flowing off the surface, the land surface, and then you get precipitation in the form of rain or whatever that's entering. And then how does water leave that ecosystem? How does the water leave this particular ecosystem? Well, it'll leave by transpiration. So the plants give off water. And then it can leave by evaporation. So the water just evaporates into the air. And then in a case like this, you'll lose some water from this particular ecosystem because streams will flow out of it. We don't have that in the ocean because streams flow into the ocean, not out of it. So this would be a way that water is lost in a watershed, that it's not lost in an ocean ecosystem. But again, the key is balance. That which is entering needs to be balanced out by that which is leaving. Okay, let's now look at the oxygen cycle. So in the oxygen cycle, again, we want to look at how does oxygen, how does it enter the atmosphere and how does it leave the atmosphere? Okay, so the air that you breathe is about 21% oxygen. Okay, so most of the air that we breathe, it's about 78% nitrogen. And nitrogen is considered an inert gas, so it doesn't really participate. You breathe it in and you breathe it out at the same percentage. It doesn't get utilized in our respiration, but oxygen does. So, and then the rest would be the remaining, like 1% would be things like carbon dioxide, argon gas. Those are the two main, CO2 and argon. But anyway, the key here is that about 21% of the air that we breathe is oxygen. So that's the oxygen that is in the air. So when we look at the oxygen cycle, then we need to say, well, how? So we have oxygen in the air. How does oxygen get removed from the air, and how does more of it enter the air? So let's look at this figure of the oxygen cycle. Okay, so here's the oxygen cycle, and okay, so in this case, now, so the up arrows are going to be those things that are going to add oxygen to the air, and the down arrows will be those things that remove oxygen from the air. Okay, so how is oxygen added to the air? Well, one way is that water vapor can be broken down. So water is H2O, right? So if you can break this water down and release this oxygen, then that oxygen can be added to the environment. Okay, so that's one way that water can, or that oxygen can be added to the air. Another way is by photosynthesis, because remember, in photosynthesis, we take you take CO2 and water, and you end up with carbohydrate and oxygen, right? So by photosynthesis, you produce oxygen, and that oxygen gets added to the air. Okay, so that's another way that oxygen can be added to the air. So photosynthesis and water vapor. And then the last way is oxygen or ozone destruction. So ozone is just this. If you've probably heard of the ozone layer. Well, it's just 3 oxygens. And so if you can break these oxygens apart, and this is the form of oxygen that's in the air. So if you can break down or break apart the ozone and release this oxygen, then that can be added to the oxygen that is in the air. Okay, so you can break down water, you can break down ozone, and you can do it by photosynthesis. Those are the way that oxygen gets added. Okay, then how does oxygen get removed from the environment? Well, one way, so now the down arrows are we're removing oxygen from the air, and so that's going to be illustrated by a down arrow. So if destroying ozone releases oxygen, then when you form ozone, that's going to remove the oxygen from the air. So if you have if you have oxygens in the air, if you have O2 in the air, and if some of those O2s are used to make ozone, then you've removed some of this oxygen from the air. So that's one way that oxygen can be removed from the air. Another way is by fires. You're probably aware that fire consumes oxygen. So when fires burn, they remove oxygen from the air, and in that particular area there would be less oxygen. Rusting of metals and minerals. Rusting is it's a process that happens with iron particularly, but with other metals and minerals, and that process utilizes oxygen, so that would remove oxygen from the air. And then this one, respiration. Remember that most organisms are aerobic, and remember that term aerobic means that they utilize oxygen, right? So when organisms, even plants, when plants make their own food, but then when they utilize that food, they're using up oxygen. When these deer or humans or any other animal that is in a particular ecosystem, when they are making energy, and they are going to be using oxygen in that process because they are aerobic. Okay, so respiration is another way that oxygen gets removed from the air in a particular ecosystem. Okay, so just in summary then, water, we break down water. Photosynthesis adds water to the air. Water vapor, if you break down water vapor, that can add oxygen to the air. And if you break down ozone, so 3 ways that oxygen can be added to the air, and then 3 ways that it can be removed from the air is if you form ozone. So you take oxygens and combine them together to form an O3, that will remove oxygen from the air. Rusting, fires, and respiration all remove oxygen from the air. So again, the key word here is balance. The oxygen that is being removed from the air, which is I've circled here in blue, needs to be balanced out with the oxygen that is being added to the air by those processes that I've circled in red. Okay, so that's the oxygen cycle. Next, we will go to the carbon cycle. And when we look at the carbon cycle, what we are looking at really is carbon dioxide, because almost all the carbon in an ecosystem will at some point be in the form of carbon dioxide. So if we look at ways that carbon dioxide enters the air and how carbon dioxide gets removed from the air, then we're really looking at carbon. Okay, so let's look then, how does carbon enter the air and how does it leave the air? So enter the air, there are 3 main ways. One of those ways is dead organisms decompose into CO2. we'll look at that in a figure in just a minute. Another is through respiration. So you know that when we breathe in oxygen, and that oxygen gets utilized by our body, but then, so we breathe in oxygen, but then what do we breathe out? We breathe out carbon dioxide. So this is the waste product. So respiration by aerobic organisms results in CO2 being breathed out, and that enters the air. And then burning. So if we took some wood and we added oxygen to it, what's that? And we let that wood burn, it's going to end up producing water and carbon dioxide, and then some ash, which is really just carbon. So when you burn something, burning produces CO2, and that CO2 enters the atmosphere. So entering the air, decomposition of dead organisms, respiration, where organisms breathe in oxygen, but they breathe out CO2, and that CO2 is going to enter the air. And then if you burn things, burning will also produce, one of the products is CO2. So if we look at the carbon cycle, so in this figure, we can see that so anytime you burn something, so here's a fire, that's going to add CO2 to the air. Burning fuel is going to add CO2 to the air. Respiration adds CO2 to the air. And then when dead organisms are decomposed primarily by bacteria or fungi, then that also adds carbon dioxide to the air. So the arrows are pointing upward, indicating that CO2 will be added to the air. Okay, so that's how CO2 enters the air. How does CO2 leave the air? It leaves the air through two primary means. One is through photosynthesis, so leaving at least by photosynthesis. So again, remember that photosynthesis is where you take CO2 plus water, and that will produce carbohydrates and oxygen. Okay, so this CO2, where's that CO2 going to come from? It's coming from the air. So that will remove CO2 from the air. And then some CO2 just gets dissolved in the ocean. So the CO2 is in the air, and some of that will just dissolve into the ocean, and then that is actually, that carbon is used to make shells. So the carbon is used by organisms within the ocean then to make shells. Okay, so those are the two main ways that carbon will leave the air. So if we look at our figure again of the carbon cycle, so let's see. So how does carbon leave the air? Well, it leaves the air by photosynthesis. Okay, so the carbon dioxide is utilized by plants, and that's going to remove that carbon from the air. And then the other one, as I said, some CO2 that is in the air just gets dissolved in the ocean and is used to make shells. Okay, so again, the key word is balance. The CO2 that leaves the air needs to be balanced by the CO2 that enters the air through whatever processes we talked about that happens. Okay, lastly, we will talk about the nitrogen cycle. And as I said earlier, about 70%, 78% of air is nitrogen. Why is nitrogen important? Well, we've learned about RNA, we've learned about DNA, we've learned about protein. All of these structures that are important to human life contain nitrogen. So nitrogen is a very important part of maintaining living organisms because it's an important component of these molecules that are involved in reproduction and involved in processes that are involved in maintaining life. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is an important one to look at. So another thing to remember is, you'll learn this in chemistry, but nitrogen gas, so this is the nitrogen that's in the air. But our bodies can't really use nitrogen in that form. The forms that our bodies use of nitrogen, so the N stands for nitrogen, are these forms. So the nitrogen has to kind of be combined with some other chemical in order for these to be able to use. So these are forms of nitrogen used by organisms. So there are ways, and there are actually living organisms that can take nitrogen gas and convert it to one of these forms, and that process is called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is taking nitrogen gas and converting it to one of these other forms that living organisms can use. Okay, that is called nitrogen fixation. And so there are different organisms that can do this. One type of organism that can do it is bacteria. So taking the nitrogen gas, changing it into a form that can be utilized by living organisms. Bacteria is one thing that can do that. So what are some ways that nitrogen can move up within the, so this figure is showing ways that nitrogen can move through the food web. So we could pick up and look at this at any point, but so let's say one of these organisms, like the hawk or the snake here, die. Okay, so here's the hawk or the snake, they die. Well, then when they die, what happens? Well, these decomposers, bacteria or fungi, will consume their dead bodies. Okay, so the decomposers come in, and when they consume those dead bodies, what they do is they are involved in taking this nitrogen and converting it into one of these nitrates, or ammonia, one of the forms of nitrogen that the body can use. Okay, so one way that happens, decomposition happens. As I said previously, nitrogen gas the bacteria can just take that nitrogen gas and convert it into these nitrates or nitrites or ammonia. And then once it is in this form, then plants can utilize that nitrogen, and they will use that nitrogen to make food, and then other animals will eat that food, like these herbivores will eat the food, and then the hawk or the snake eats these herbivores, and so the nitrogen moves through the food web in that way. Okay, so if we can review that again. So this is just showing the ways that nitrogen can be converted from nitrogen gas to forms that organisms can use. Okay, so here we have nitrogen gas. So here's nitrogen gas, and bacteria can take that nitrogen gas, and through that process, it's called nitrogen fixation, can change that nitrogen gas into one of these forms. And those forms then can be used by plants, producers, to produce food. Okay, so then that's used by these, and then what happens? Well, then these organisms consume those plants, so they eat those plants, and as they do that, they're incorporating the nitrogen into them, and then these organisms consume these organisms, and as they do that, what are they doing? They are consuming that nitrogen along with them. Then when these guys die, their bodies are decomposed, and bacteria and fungi will take the nitrogen. When they're decomposed, that nitrogen ends up back in the whole cycle, and the whole thing starts again. Okay, so it's just showing the ways that that nitrogen gets moved through the food web by nitrogen fixation, but then also by decomposition, so that the nitrogen doesn't stay in that form, nitrogen gas, which can't be utilized, but instead gets changed into one of these other forms, NO3, NO2, or ammonia, which is NH3. So these are all forms of the nitrogen that that living organisms are able to use. I should also mention that sometimes, the other thing that's on this figure, and I'll stop with this, is that sometimes these bacteria can actually take these nitrates and the bacteria can actually convert it back into nitrogen gas. Okay, so now we're going from the forms that can be used back into the nitrogen gas. And then, then the bacteria again take that nitrogen gas, and through nitrogen fixation can convert it back. But so there has to be ways for the nitrogen gas to enter the atmosphere, but also to leave the atmosphere so that this whole process stays balanced. Okay, so I think we will stop there for today. So the water cycle, oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, and then the nitrogen cycle and how nitrogen gas gets changed into forms that are usable. Okay, that's it for Module 11.